but it encourages students to make connections and start forming their own structure for the book to sit into before they've opened it up and start to read. It provides opportunities for early discussion of ideas and concepts. It develops inference very strongly. So the kind of inference, the reading between the lines that you use when you're reading books which are often quite figurative or deal with metaphor, and also those skills of inference and prediction. One of the advantages of this is it's a high challenge, low threshold activity. By which I mean, if you've got students that struggle with just understanding the words, they can use this activity as a way to get to know the vocabulary. They can write definitions underneath and spend some extra time getting to know what the words mean. If in the same class, and we know this often happens, you've got students who are flying with the vocabulary and actually very sophisticated in the way that they're thinking about their reading, to them you can say, right, I want you to group it. I want you to put the words in the groups. And now from that grouping, I want you to make predictions about what happens in this book, who the characters might be, what are the big ideas that sit underneath this text. And they can go off and work on a very challenging cognitive task, where they're thinking about patterns and connections. And it's the same task, words taken from the text, but that is accessible and useful to both. Right, I'm going to move into a different sort of bit more theoretical talk about reading now for just a second. Before I do, does anybody have any questions about that first task I introduced? No, we good? Well, if you do, just pop it in the chat and I can address it as we go. Okay, a bit of background, because reading is actually an enormously complicated process. We can all do it, but if you stop to think about it, I think we would struggle with how. So I'm presenting you with the simple view of reading, which was for the Rose Review document. And when we send this PowerPoint round, there's a bibliography at the end, and there are links in the notes so that you can see where I got all of these things from. Obviously, a lot of it is taken from a variety of different sources, and I've pulled it together to show to you now. So the simple view of reading is this. Reading is made up of two sets of processes. There's word recognition and there's language comprehension. Now, we can be good or poor word recognizers, so decoders, in terms of breaking down which sounds match to which letters on the page, that sort of phonetic decoding that we do when we're working out what words sound like. That's word recognition. Now, language comprehension is different. It's about understanding what these words mean. And beyond that, when these words are put together into sentences, what do these sentences mean? How does this come together so that we're making sense of what the text is trying to tell us? So you can be a very good word recognizer. You can decode beautifully, you can read out loud, you can understand what those words sound like, and you can sound fluent. But you could also be a poor word recognizer in that you're not great at decoding on the page. You sometimes guess, you make frequent errors, you're not necessarily always sure of which sounds go with which letters. You can be a good comprehender, you understand the meanings in the text, or you could be a poor language comprehender. You might be able to say the words out loud, but you don't necessarily know the meaning of them when they're put together. So we have 4 quadrants here, essentially. You've got good comprehender, good word recognizer. These are your really fluent readers. That's your top right quadrants here. These students, and actually any reader, is good at seeing how you decode words and good at understanding what they mean. Now, you can be a good word recognizer, but a poor comprehender. So these students are fluent when they're reading, but when you ask them questions about what they've just read, they can't really tell you. And I've worked with a lot of students like that who seem good when they're reading out loud, but then don't really understand the meanings of what they've come across. You can have a poor word recognizer and poor comprehender, and these are our really struggling readers because they struggle with both. Now, this quadrant's interesting, top left. Not very good at word recognizing, but good at understanding the big ideas. Now, these are students who rush their decoding or don't necessarily know how to sound out. My son sits in that bracket. Actually, he's a great reader, but he's so excited to get to the next point in the narrative, he often misreads the words and he needs to stop and focus and go back. So we use different strategies depending on where we are in this quadrant. So if you've got somebody who, for example, let's stay in that quadrant top left, isn't so good at the decoding, but understands the big ideas, we need to do some activities like the one I just showed you, taking the words out of the text in advance and talking about them and making sure we've read each one correctly is a really good foundation for these students. We can also do some work on the phonics. It might be, and I'm not covering phonics in this webinar because phonics is a whole other area of its own. I'm really looking at language comprehension more than phonics. If you've got someone who's a poor decoder, then you'd want to do some work on grapheme phoneme correspondence. So does that sound match that letter? If we go down and we've got a student who's not great at word recognition or language comprehension, we've got a lot of work to do on the phonics and the segmenting of blending, practicing reading aloud, reading in pairs, lots of opportunities for focus support. Someone who's good at saying the words, but not so great at understanding the meanings. This is discussion. This is drama techniques. This is the ideas beneath the text. And really interestingly, this is visualization. Can they draw what they've read? Because to draw what you've read, you've got to be able to understand it. That task of being able to sketch out what they've read in little annotated drawings is the best metacognitive thing I know, because in visualizing, you create a complete picture of what you've just read. We've also got reading aloud and reciprocal teaching, and I'll come to reciprocal teaching in a minute. And if you're good at both, let's go deep. Let's think about really challenging texts. Let's think about analyzing the language and comparing text one to the other, focusing on the themes and big ideas. So there are different strategies that we can use to support our readers, and a lot of them overlap, but there are lots of different aspects to it. So I'm going to talk through some of these strategies as we go. So Wayne Tennant is someone I'm going to refer back to as a bit of a touchstone in this webinar because his work on reading is incredible. And if you get a chance to read his books or to watch any of the talks he does, he's fascinating when he talks about the complicated nature of reading. So he says that children have a spoken language comprehension far in excess of their ability to decode. And that's really where we're thinking about native speakers of the language. So it doesn't matter which language we're thinking about here. But it doesn't make sense to stall or stagnate the comprehension component until the decoding has been mastered, by which he means you can always talk about the meaning. And when we're doing reading, the meaning is the fun bit. The exploration of the ideas in the text can be focused on no matter how young the child or how good or not so good they are at being able to read the individual words. And to do this, we use talk. Really important to be able to use talk in making sense of the text that we read. And it's through talk that we not only understand the books we read, but we learn to love the books we read, because it's the ideas that we're connecting with when we do that. So providing opportunities for students to talk about texts and do that as a way of assessing their reading, listening to their discussions is vital. Almost every strategy I share with you now is talk-based for that reason, so that we're not assessing understanding of reading through writing necessarily. Okay, so reading's complicated. And this is a simple way of showing it, but it's super complicated because reading is an invisible process. And if I sat here and did reading, it would be a super dull webinar. You would be watching me do essentially nothing if I was reading in my head for the next half an hour or so. But what I would be going through on the inside would be very rich and complicated and engaging, but you cannot see it. So an example of how complicated reading is as a sense-making process. I've taken this from Wayne Tennant, but Daniel Willingham, another reading theorist, does something similar. I have got these two sentences. The test was a breeze, and I finished it in 20 minutes. I went home early. Now, to you and to me and all the other adult readers on this call, that's fine, right? Got it. Not hard to understand, but let's consider the sense-making that goes behind it. So the test was a breeze. A breeze here is idiomatic. Yeah, it could mean windy. It could mean easy. And from the context of this, we don't quite know yet which one it means. We know if we're super fluent, which one it probably is. Now, I finished it in 20 minutes. Now, to us, a test in 20 minutes is quick. We understand that that reinforces that previous meaning of it being easy. Those two things work together. To an 8-year-old child, 20 minutes is a lifetime. You tell them they can't have a snack for 20 minutes and they're in agonies. It's so long. So our understanding of 20 minutes as a short period of time is subjective, and it's an adult perspective. We've then got this seemingly totally random sentence after this. I went home early. Great. There is no connection necessarily between the first sentence and the second sentence unless we have understood that that test was super simple and 20 minutes is the short amount of time. And there's also a contextual link here. We understand that if you finish someone as an adult with our own agency, you can go home. But if you're a child in school doing a test, you don't go anywhere if you finish, you stay sat there. So the idea that you went home early because that test was easy, because you finished it fast, are all bits of sense making, bits of inference that we have done behind these sentences. All of that needed to happen in our understanding for this to make sense. If I was a child, those links would not necessarily happen. So when we're reading, those connections and that inference has to be made visible. And it's really important that we show students the background work that happens in this reading. Otherwise, all of that extra thinking doesn't make sense to them. Now, one way of doing this is to use think alouds to show how you build an understanding of the text as you read it, to make the process of reading visible and audible. So whereas reading aloud will tell you what students can see on the page and how they link sounds to letters, a think aloud makes those language comprehension processes visible and audible. It tells you what they've understood. So one way of doing this is through text annotation, like this. So this is an example of an annotation of the text, Joe in the package. And I have annotated with my thinking as I've gone through. So if we start Joe in the package, I'm making a prediction. When I see the word package, I think this is going to be about present, because I know that packages can contain exciting things and that sometimes presents come in the post. As we go through, Joe crept along to Grandma's room and it was in darkness. So I've got a question here, which I'm not sure about because I don't know why Grandma's room is dark. Maybe it's because it was nighttime. That might be one reason. You might have some other reasons why it might be dark, like Grandma might have gone out. She might not be there, which would help me understand why she's creeping along. She edged the door open and peeped inside the empty room. Edged is interesting here. What does that mean? Because I know edge is a word like the edge of a table, but edged as a verb, what does that mean? I've got a question there that I'm going to need to investigate. On the bedside table stood the package covered with strange stamps. That's interesting. Why are the stamps strange? Now, this is based on children knowing that stamps in different countries are different, and that when you send something from one country, they're going to have different stamps from the country you're in. And that really depends on how much stuff your students have received in the post, or how often they've traveled abroad and seen stamps elsewhere. So that's going to need to be unpicked a bit. Jo held her breath and tiptoed to the table. The package was like a magnet. Interesting bit of figurative language there. Why is it like a magnet? Is it like a rectangle? Is it like a horseshoe shape? Because that's not what this means. This is about it being really attractive and drawing you to it, but we're going to need to unpick that a little bit. It seemed to draw her in and her fingers itched. She just had to know what was inside. Why are her fingers itching? Has Jo suddenly developed some sort of medical complaint that we're being introduced to at this part of the text? Or is there a reason why? Because this is another bit of metaphorical language. This is figurative. Why are her fingers itching? And we need to unpick that as well. But me making this visible, me saying these are the questions I ask in my head when I'm reading this text, helps show my language comprehension process. So This is also a really useful strategy for students who are coming to English for the first time, because it shows the sense-making process that helps them make sense of new information. It helps them to activate prior knowledge of a text and builds their confidence in how you read, not just what it sounds like. If you preview the difficult words in the pre-reading task, like we did in this session, that can also help this task. And the teacher can help clarify any strange meanings, like figurative language or things they might have come across, like edged. And then after the read aloud, you can go over these keywords again to really help develop the child's understanding. But this is going to work best if you do it. So this is a Jamboard activity where you are in breakout groups. So you're in 4 breakout groups, and you've each got a copy of this text from the promise. Now, I have started my think aloud on the promise by asking some questions. Now, you can make predictions, you can ask questions, you can identify hard words and put like, what does this mean next to it? So I've done when I was young. My first question is, who is I? I don't know who this I is. It's not making sense to me. So I've got a question there. And I lived in a city that was mean and hard. Who's mean and hard? Is that the city? Is that the buildings, the people? So I've got questions as I go through that I've started annotating with. What I'd like you to do is in your breakout rooms now, just read this text and then annotate with the processes you're going through as you try to make sense of it. So that will probably take you between 5 and 10 minutes. Okay, so hopefully what you would have understood for that is a way to bring the book to life and to start investigating the ideas that sit below the text before you read it, and to make your thinking processes, the deep ones that we go through, really, really visible and audible. So there are different ways of doing this task. One is that the teacher models how to do it and students listen. Or my favorite way is to do it and the students do it as well. Or students can do it together in groups, or they can do it on their own using post-it notes or annotation. And this can be a good activity to do before they read the text in class. So you can do it almost for homework if you wanted to, or as a pre-reading activity before they go into reading something and answering questions on it in class. Now, you can use a number of different strategies. You can use questioning, which is the one I defaulted to there, which is about the text, the characters, and the action. You can use prediction, what you think might happen. You can clarify definitions or work within translation, working out what words mean. You can summarize what the text is about or what your other group members have said about it. You can annotate for what the text makes you feel, so sort of personal response there, what you understand the characters to feel. Or you can visualize and you can annotate with drawings, which, although it sounds simple, is actually a very, very good way of comprehending to make sure you really understand what the text is showing you. Now, these strategies are actually reciprocal teaching strategies, so they're different comprehension strategies that we use to make sense of texts. And you don't just use them with think alouds necessarily. This is also a discussion technique. So another way of doing this is to, with any extract, whether it's fiction or prose or poetry or non-fiction, you can give each one of these roles, like questioner, summarizer, predictor, and clarifier, to different students within a group. And then they make predictions about the text and ask their other group members to make predictions. And they read the text together and they underline and ask questions about key parts of the text. So if you want to structure this kind of work as group work, it can be really useful to choose the strategies you're going to use. And I wouldn't necessarily use all 6. I'd use maybe 3 or 4. And then ask students to be responsible for investigating that aspect within the text that you're looking at. And it really helps students go deeper. Also very good for discussion. If you're interested in this, there's a link on the page that goes into this in much more detail. Okay, now I'm going to use the next bit of the webinar. It's gone very fast, but I'm going to use this next little bit to talk about other strategies and activities for reading. So another good way of investigating texts and comprehending them is to use 3 levels of questioning. And this is based on Wayne Tennant's work on reading comprehension again. So we've got a looking question, which is about literal comprehension, like what's the text about? A clue question, making connections and inferences. So in the text we just read, that hungry dog, and what did that mean? That's an inference question. And a thinking question, where you go beyond the text and you make a connection to your personal response, or you make a link to the wider world and things you might have experienced to really anchor the text within your understanding of other knowledge and schemas. So if we were taking this same extract that we've just done in Think Aloud, a looking question that asks for literal comprehension, what did the character take from the old lady? So, the character took their bag. A clue question, how did the old lady feel about giving it up? That would require inference. So she held on with the strength of heroes, which suggests that she's reluctant. And a thinking question. So we've got here this promise that's made at the end, all right, I promise. So what promises have you made? And have you ever made a promise that you couldn't keep? Asking students to reflect on their personal response. Now, I used to work as a schools advisor, working with teachers in primary and secondary schools on how to plan reading and other English work in Hampshire in the UK. And the advisory service there still has a good website with lots of open resources on. And they are freely available to anybody who wants to click on the link. And one of the things they've got are these 3 levels of questioning for different forms of comprehension. So for example, if you want to clarify, or you want to infer, or you want to look at themes and ideas, here are some looking questions, clue questions, and expansive questions that you could ask. And that's available as a document. So if it's a big A3 document, and they have it for primary and also for Key Stage 3, I think. So if you wanted to use that 3-question method, then you can go and find these questions on their website, and the link is there. Another useful thing you can do is ask your students to make their own questions about their text. So talking to the hand is quite a useful way of getting them to remember what questions to ask. So you can have a who, what, where, when, and why, and how. And if you ask students to make their own questions up, this is quite useful, and it builds directly from the Think Aloud work we did, because then they have to answer those questions themselves, which leads them further into deeper understanding. Or they can set those questions for somebody else in the class or another group. So if you wanted them to think about, what is the hungry dog, you could set that question, and then they could ask another group to answer it. So the process of creating the questions and answering the questions deepens their comprehension on both sides. Right, I'm going to go deep into talk for a moment now. Now, this was going to be another activity, but I think I'll just do it as a big group, because we're not going to have enough time to go into breakout rooms again. Sorry, Margaret. So we'll just talk it through, and I'm going to start off with talking about image, because reading image is a very similar process to reading text. It requires literal comprehension, what am I looking at, and deeper inference, what does that mean? So the question here is, what is happening in this text? It's a relatively straightforward question, and by text I mean the image. But what I want to do now is structure the talk so that we go deeper. So we go behind the surface. So the simplest answer will be there's some polar bears and some ice. But that is not the deepest answer we can get. There's a lot else happening in this text. There's a lot of other messaging. Now, sometimes students struggle to go deeper. They struggle to explore fully the meanings of a text in their talk, and they need to be prompted to do so. So a useful way to do this is to give them talk prompts that encourage them to investigate multiple meanings and tentative understandings. So you're letting the right answer go, and you're using prompt modals like could and might and maybe. And then you can also go for seems as if, makes the reader feel, and suggests, right? So if I'm looking at these polar bears, they could have got stuck. That might be what's happening. Or maybe they were put there. But it seems as if, from the way that they're looking at us, that they're kind of lost. And this makes the reader, me the reader looking at them, feel kind of sad. So if we were going with suggest, this suggests the deeper message, right? Why are we being made to feel sad about the polar bears on the ice floe? What else is going on here that we're being told about?
The ice is melting.
Right, so maybe the ice is melting. So maybe that's what's happening with this text. This is a text about the ice melting. But why is the ice melting?
Maybe the global warming.
Right, so maybe this is a text about global warming. Maybe the polar bears are stuck because of global warming. Well, that makes the reader feel worse, right? Because maybe the polar bears are sad because somehow it's our fault. So we're going deeper and deeper here. So we take the surface meaning and we go deeper and deeper into alternative meanings using the prompts. Now, this is my favorite talk strategy. I've been using it a long time, and I've used it right the way up from my youngest learners right the way through to my oldest learners, because if you increase the complexity of the text, and even with a very simple text like the one I just showed you, it still works beautifully, and you can change the prompts that you use. So here's another image, and this is taken from Sean Tam's wordless picture book, The Arrival, which is really good for exploratory talk. So here I've got the same words, but I've gone a bit deeper, because I've also got represent and symbolize down the right-hand side. So here we've got some tentacles in the sky. Now these could be a monster, but they could also represent something else. So they could represent threat. They could symbolize that something bad is happening to the city and we don't know what it is. And the fact that the people are very small could suggest they're kind of vulnerable. And potentially they could get hurt. So we can start to use these talk prompts to investigate the alternative meanings that go below the surface of the text. Now, when I do this, I put these prompt cards literally on cards, and the students are in groups and they can't talk unless they take a card, and they can choose which one they want to take, and then they make a sentence and contribute to the discussion using that card. And if I've got different groups of students who are working at different levels in their language comprehension, I can give them different cards. I wouldn't give them all symbolize necessarily, but my most advanced readers, I might. Now you could use these cards as is, or potentially, and this was going to be our task, but we don't really have time for it. You could think about what talked prompt cards you would like to use for the students that you teach. You could have it makes me think, or perhaps, or I think, or in my opinion. And you could have other prompts that they put on the cards that they have to take before they speak, but that encourage them to offer a response that is tentative and takes them beyond the surface of the text. So it's just initial thinking, but in discussion, they will go deeper. Now, this is a simple strategy, but it's actually based on some really deep research that came out of Cambridge University from the theorists Neil Mercer, Karen Littleton, and also Dawes, Mercer, and Wegeroff back in 2000. And this is exploratory talk. So the idea is that partners and group members engage critically but constructively with each other's ideas. It's meant to encourage everybody to participate, but to talk tentatively so that the thinking and the reasoning is visible in the talk. So that process of comprehension is visible, so you start to understand how other people make sense of texts. And all opinions are considered. Nothing is ridiculous, but you can respond and challenge someone's interpretation and give a different version or a different understanding. This is really lovely theory. If anybody's interested in studying it further, I strongly recommend looking at Mercer's work. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, I just have a couple of minutes, is thinking about themes. So thinking about the messages or big ideas in a text, which are always accessible to students because they're based on your lived experience. So they call to your own experience and ask you to bring it to the text. So themes are things like friendship or loss, betrayal, duty, and these are global, right? It's why texts such as Shakespeare and things still have modern relevance, because it deals with things that are universal. And accessing the themes in a text are what make them very, very engaging, even when the text itself is simple or challenging. So a way you can do this for your youngest learners is just this simple quadrant. If I've got very young students, so 5, 6, 7-year-olds, and you can go beyond with this, but it's a good way in for them. What do they like about the book? What do they dislike about the book? What questions do they have about the book? And what connections do they have with the book? Like, have you made a promise? And they can just fill this in with their initial thoughts. You can also think about comparing books. So here are 3 books about promises. And we can think about what different promises were made in these stories. And did their characters keep their promise? Yes or no? And have you made a promise you couldn't keep? And is it reasonable to ask people to keep their promises? Great for discussion. And then you're looking at intertextuality, which is a really complicated word for something that's actually really simple and engaging, which is where you take books and you look at the points of connection between the two. Another way of doing this is to think about a key concept, such as the idea of promise, and for students to list as many words as they could around that word, and then go away and steal ideas from other groups. So what other words can they find to create a semantic word web, which is another way of saying a mind map. It's just a word web about an idea. Now they could group those words, consider the connections and patterns like we did with the bag of words at the start, and then choose their 3 most important words to share with the class. But that would become a whole lesson, a lesson in which you investigate an idea, a theme, and then you connect it back to your book, but you've come to your book with a deeper understanding. Finally, there are other ways to compare characters or consider how to track an idea as it moves across a text. And this is for your older readers, as they were perhaps looking at a book where the idea of promises or friendship changes as you work through it. I don't know if you've done the roll on the wall where you take a sketch of the character and inside you make notes about what they're feeling, and outside you make notes about their actions and what they do in the book. You can also do this as they go through a book and they change. So you can sketch them at the start, what they feel, what they do. Then you can move to the next part of the book a few chapters later, what they feel, what they do. You can move to the next point and you end up with a paper chain, essentially. But what you have there is a deeper understanding of character development across a text. So you're taking how their feelings change through the book and then how their actions change during the book, which would be a really good pre-bit of work for producing a written piece later about what they'd just read, or for a discussion about how characters change and develop. So in summary, reading is a complex and invisible process. And the teaching of reading is about making reading processes visible and audible. And so these interactive strategies where you make that process visible, are effective because they scaffold that process. It shows students what that process looks like for other people. It's good to do it through talk so that the act of writing isn't a barrier to demonstrating understanding. But when you do this, talk tasks need to be modeled and structured just as carefully as writing tasks, otherwise you'll just get surface understanding. And all of this rests on the choice of texts. So high quality and authentic texts with deep themes and ideas need to be used to give students enough to connect with and talk about. And that's me. So I know we've gone over, so if you don't want to do questions and you have to shoot, that's just fine. But if you do want to, I'm here for the next 10 minutes or so that we can talk about it.